They thought they could take my land. But I had a surprise waiting. The day started like any other quiet afternoon in the neighborhood. I had just finished running a few errands in town and was looking forward to getting home, grabbing a cold drink, and enjoying the peace of my property. My land sat at the edge of the neighborhood, a wide open piece of ground that I had worked hard to maintain over the years. It wasn't just another suburban yard, it was something I had invested time, money, and pride into. That's why the moment I turned onto my street, something immediately felt off. Even before I pulled into my driveway, I could hear the sound of heavy machinery. Loud engines, the metallic clank of equipment, and the deep grinding noise of something digging into the earth echoed through the normally quiet neighborhood. At first, I assumed someone nearby must have been doing construction or landscaping work. It wasn't unusual for people to renovate their yards around here. But as I drove closer to my property, the sounds got louder, and my confusion quickly turned into concern. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I froze. Right there, in the middle of my land, was a large excavator digging a massive hole. Piles of dirt were stacked all around the area, and several workers wearing reflective vests were moving around like they had been there for hours. One of them was directing the excavator operator while another was measuring something with a long metal pole. For a few seconds, I genuinely thought I had pulled into the wrong property. But no, this was definitely my land. My first reaction was disbelief. I stepped out of my car slowly, staring at the growing crater in the ground. It was already several feet deep, and it looked like they were shaping it into some kind of pond or water feature. The workers didn't even seem surprised to see me standing there. In fact, they barely acknowledged me at all, as if I was just another neighbor stopping by to watch. That's when I finally walked closer and asked the obvious question, "Hey, what exactly is going on here?" One of the workers shut off the excavator and climbed down from the machine. He wiped his hands on his work pants and looked at me like the situation was completely normal. "We're digging the pond," he said casually. "The pond," I repeated, completely confused. "On my property." He frowned slightly, then pointed toward the back of the lot where several wooden stakes and spray-painted markings had been placed. "Yeah," he said. "This area's been approved for a community pond project." For a moment, I just stared at him, trying to process what he had just said. A community pond? On my land? I told him as calmly as I could that this was private property, and that nobody had ever contacted me about any pond project. The worker shrugged and explained that they were simply following the job order they were given. According to their paperwork, the local HOA had approved the construction and hired their company to start digging earlier that morning. That's when the reality of the situation finally hit me. Somehow, someone had decided they could build a pond on my land and they hadn't even bothered to ask me first. And judging by the size of the hole already carved into my property, they had been very confident about it. Little did I know at that moment, this was only the beginning of a situation that was about to spiral into one of the most unbelievable HOA conflicts I had ever experienced. The more I stood there watching the machines carve deeper into my land, the more it felt like I had stepped into some kind of absurd misunderstanding. But the workers were clearly convinced they were doing exactly what they had been hired to do. After a few more questions, one of them mentioned that if I had an issue, I should probably speak with the HOA president because she was the one who had approved the project. That name alone told me everything I needed to know. Our neighborhood HOA president had built a reputation over the years, and not a good one. She was the kind of person who treated the HOA like it was her personal kingdom. People in the neighborhood often joked about her behind her back, calling her the classic HOA Karen. She enforced every tiny rule with enthusiasm, sent warning letters over things like slightly tall grass or trash cans being visible for too long, and acted like she had authority over everyone's property. Still, even she couldn't possibly think she had the right to approve construction on someone else's land. At least, that's what I thought. I decided the situation needed to be addressed immediately. I walked back to my house, grabbed my phone, and called the HOA number listed on the community website. After a few rings, she answered. The moment I explained what was happening on my property, her tone shifted from polite to irritated almost instantly. "Oh, that," she said dismissively, like I had called to complain about something trivial. "Yes, that's the new community pond project." I paused, trying to stay calm. I told her very clearly that the land being dug up belonged to me and that nobody had ever asked for my permission. Her response made my jaw tighten. "Well," she said, drawing the word out slowly, "that section of land has always been considered part of the community open space." For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. "Excuse me," I replied. She went on to explain, in the most condescending tone imaginable, that the HOA board had voted to improve the neighborhood by adding a decorative pond and small park area. According to her, my property sat along the edge of what she described as shared green space, and the pond would benefit everyone in the community. I reminded her again that the land was clearly inside my property lines. I had bought the lot years ago, and it was listed plainly in my deed and property survey. But instead of acknowledging that, she doubled down. "You're being a little selfish about this," she said. "This improvement will increase property values for everyone." That was the moment the conversation stopped being confusing and started becoming infuriating. She wasn't misunderstanding the situation. She had simply decided that the HOA had the right to use my land because it suited her plan. When I told her again that the workers needed to stop immediately, she gave a short, annoyed laugh. "The project has already been approved by the board," she said. "Stopping it now would be very inconvenient." Inconvenient. The word echoed in my mind as I looked out the window, toward the excavator still tearing into the ground outside. Dirt continued piling higher around the growing crater that was supposed to become a pond. She finished the call with one final comment that made it clear exactly how she viewed the situation. "If you have a problem," she said sharply, "you can bring it up at the next HOA meeting." Then she hung up. I stood there staring at my phone for a moment, realizing something important. The HOA Karen didn't think I could stop this. In her mind, the decision had already been made, and I was just another resident who would eventually fall in line. But what she didn't realize was that she had just made a very big mistake. By the time the next HOA meeting arrived, the situation on my property had already gotten worse. The workers had continued digging for another full day before I managed to pressure them into pausing the project temporarily. Even then, the damage had already been done. What used to be a flat section of land had turned into a massive crater surrounded by piles of loose dirt. Every time I looked at it, my frustration grew stronger. But I didn't go into that HOA meeting angry or shouting. I went prepared. Over the past few days, I had spent hours gathering every document related to my property. I pulled out my original purchase papers, the official deed, and the detailed land survey that had been completed when I bought the house. I even contacted the county records office and requested a copy of the official property boundary map, just to remove any possible doubt. By the time I was finished, I had a thick folder filled with documents that clearly showed exactly where my land began and ended. And right in the middle of those boundaries sat the giant hole they had started digging. The HOA meeting was held in the small community clubhouse like it always was. When I walked in, several neighbors were already sitting in the folding chairs, chatting quietly while the board members prepared their notes at the front table. At the center of it all sat the HOA president herself, looking as confident and self-assured as ever. When she saw me enter the room holding a folder full of papers, her expression shifted slightly. It wasn't concern, more like mild annoyance. The meeting started with the usual routine: neighborhood updates, minor rule discussions, and a few complaints about parking and landscaping. I sat quietly the entire time, waiting for the moment when residents were allowed to speak. Finally, that moment came. When the floor opened for community concerns, I stood up and calmly addressed the room. I explained that construction crews had been digging a pond on my land without my permission and that the project had been approved by the HOA. Immediately, the room grew quiet. Several neighbors turned toward the board members with confused looks. A few of them clearly had no idea a pond project had even been planned. The HOA president leaned forward in her chair and tried to maintain control of the conversation. She repeated the same claim she had made on the phone, that the land had been considered shared community space for years, and that the pond would benefit the entire neighborhood. That's when I walked to the front of the room and placed my folder. On the table, one by one, I laid out the documents. First, the original property deed with the legal description of the land. Then the survey map showing the exact boundary lines. Finally, the official county records clearly marking the lot as privately owned property. I turned the survey map around so everyone in the room could see it clearly. Then I pointed directly to the section where the pond had been started. This, I said calmly, is where your contractors are digging. The room stayed silent as people leaned forward to look closer. A few neighbors whispered to each other. One of them even pulled out his phone to take a picture of the map. It was becoming obvious that the situation wasn't as simple as the HOA president had claimed. She tried to interrupt, saying the board had previously discussed using the space for community improvements. But this time, the tone in the room had changed. The confidence she carried earlier began to fade as more people realized what was happening. Because the documents didn't just suggest the land was mine, they proved it. For the first time since this whole mess started, the HOA president didn't have an immediate response. She stared down at the survey map on the table, completely silent. And in that moment, the entire room understood something important. The HOA had just authorized construction on property they didn't actually own. After that HOA meeting, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed almost immediately. Word spread quickly about what had happened in the clubhouse, and people began to realize that the pond project had been approved without proper authority. Some neighbors were angry, others were simply shocked, but the one person who still seemed unwilling to admit any fault was the HOA president herself. The next morning, I looked out at my property again. The half-finished pond sat there like a giant scar in the middle of my land. The digging had stopped, but that didn't mean the problem was solved. The ground was uneven, piles of dirt surrounded the hole, and rainwater had already started collecting in the bottom. It was clear that simply leaving things the way they were wasn't an option. I waited a full day to see if the HOA would contact me with a plan to fix the damage they had caused. They didn't. No apology, no offer to restore the land. Nothing. It was almost as if they were hoping the situation would somehow disappear on its own. That's when I decided I was done waiting. If they weren't going to fix what they had started, I would, but I wasn't about to grab a shovel and handle it myself. The hole they had dug was massive, and restoring the land properly would require serious equipment. Fortunately, I knew exactly who to call. There was a local company in town that specialized in excavation and land grading. They handled everything from construction sites to farmland leveling, and they had the kind of heavy machinery that could move mountains of dirt in a matter of hours. I contacted them, explained the situation, and asked if they could come out and assess the property. The owner of the company arrived the next afternoon. When he saw the giant pit sitting in the middle of my land, he shook his head slowly. "Someone got a little ambitious here," he said. I explained that the HOA had started digging without permission and that I wanted the entire area restored exactly the way it had been before. After walking around the site and taking a few measurements, he told me it would take several large machines and a full crew to move all the soil back, compact the ground properly, and level the surface again. I told him to schedule the job as soon as possible. 2 days later, the quiet neighborhood woke up to a sight nobody expected. Early in the morning, a convoy of massive earth-moving machines rolled down the street toward my property. Bulldozers, dump trucks, and large loaders arrived one after another, rumbling loudly as they positioned themselves around the unfinished pond. Neighbors stepped outside their houses to watch. Some of them had seen the earlier digging and were curious about what was happening now. Others probably suspected exactly what was about to unfold. Within minutes, the crew got to work. The bulldozers began pushing the piles of dirt back toward the hole, while the loaders moved soil with huge scoops. Dump trucks shifted material across the site, and the ground shook slightly as the heavy machines worked together like a carefully coordinated operation. Standing there watching it all unfold, I felt something I hadn't felt since the whole situation began: satisfaction. Because this wasn't just about fixing the damage anymore. This was about making it clear that my land wasn't something the HOA could casually take control of whenever they wanted. And somewhere in the neighborhood, I knew the HOA president was probably watching the exact same scene, realizing that the pond she had been so confident about was about to disappear. The restoration work moved faster than anyone in the neighborhood expected. The earth-moving crew worked with a level of efficiency that only comes from years of experience handling large projects. What had taken the original contractors days of digging was now being reversed in a matter of hours. Huge bulldozers pushed soil back into the crater, while loaders carefully spread the dirt across the site, slowly erasing every trace of the unfinished pond. By mid-morning, the giant hole that had once dominated the center of my property was already half filled. The machines roared and rumbled as they worked, their engines echoing through the neighborhood. Every scoop of dirt and every push of the bulldozer blade brought the land closer to the way it had looked before the HOA ever got involved. Naturally, the spectacle attracted attention. Neighbors began gathering along the street and sidewalks, watching the process unfold. Some stood quietly with their arms crossed, while others chatted with each other about what had happened over the past week. A few even walked closer to the edge of my property to get a better view of the machinery. It wasn't long before I noticed a very familiar figure standing at the edge of the crowd. The HOA president had arrived. She stood there with her arms tightly folded, staring at the heavy equipment moving across my land. The confident attitude she had shown during our earlier conversations was gone. In its place was a mixture of frustration and disbelief as she watched the pond project she had approved slowly disappear. At one point, she walked over toward the foreman of the crew and tried to ask what was happening. I could hear the foreman explained calmly that he had been hired by the property owner to restore the land to its original condition. The answer clearly wasn't what she wanted to hear. The machines kept working. By early afternoon, the hole had completely vanished beneath layers of packed soil. The crew carefully leveled the ground, smoothing out the area so it blended naturally with the rest of the property. A large grading machine made slow, precise passes over the surface, ensuring the land was even and stable. Watching the process felt strangely satisfying. For days, that unfinished pond had been a reminder of someone else's arrogance and assumptions about my property. Now, little by little, it was being erased like it had never existed. Eventually, the last stage of the job began. The crew compacted the soil to prevent future sinking and finished leveling the area, so it matched the surrounding land perfectly. When they were done, the giant machines slowly began loading up and preparing to leave. By the time the sun started dropping toward the horizon, the transformation was complete. Where there had once been a massive crater, there was now nothing more than flat, clean ground. The earth-moving trucks rolled out of the neighborhood one by one, leaving behind a quiet street and a group of neighbors who had just witnessed the entire situation come full circle. The HOA president stood there for a few more minutes, staring at the restored land. The pond she had insisted on building was completely gone. And in that moment, the message was unmistakably clear. My property was mine and no HOA. Karen was going to decide otherwise. Subscribe and join the chaos.